metallic halls of Station Nexus. 7 stretched endlessly in every direction, their surfaces polished to a mirror shine. Soft blue lights pulsed along the ceiling panels, maintaining the exact temperature and humidity levels preferred by the station's diverse inhabitants. Everything about the Galactic Academy spoke of precision, order, and complete control. In Classroom 47B, 32 students sat in perfectly aligned rows, their attention focused on the holographic display floating at the front of the room. The students came from a dozen different worlds, yet they all shared one quality: complete and utter silence. Not even the sound of breathing disturbed the air. The insectoid Vrexians sat with their forearms folded identically across their chitinous chests. The amphibious Quellans kept their large eyes fixed forward, their skin maintaining a neutral gray color. The Zephyr students, beings made of living crystal, stood motionless at their stations, their internal lights barely flickering. At the front of the room, Instructor Hilera clicked through her presentation with mechanical efficiency. Her mandibles moved with practiced precision as she spoke. Emotional responses represent a significant inefficiency in cognitive processing. Species that rely heavily on emotional decision-making demonstrate a 47% decrease in optimal outcomes across standardized scenarios. The words hung in the air like mathematical formulas. Students recorded the information into their devices without question or comment. This was learning at the Galactic Academy. Pure data transfer from instructor to student, as clean and sterile as a surgical procedure. Hylara continued, her voice never rising or falling in tone. Consider the case of the Milleran civilization. Archaeological evidence suggests they possessed advanced technology and favorable planetary conditions. However, records indicate they made several critical decisions based on what they termed hope and fear rather than statistical probability. The result was complete extinction within 2 generations. A Vrexian student named Korax tapped notes into his device. The information would be stored, memorized, and repeated on the upcoming examination. He had attended this academy for 3 cycles now, and every day followed the same pattern. Arrive at the designated time. Sit in the assigned seat. Absorb information. Return to quarters. Repeat. The routine was comfortable in its predictability, even if something deep in his mind occasionally whispered that it was also deeply hollow. Beside him, a Quellan student called Prill kept her gaze forward. Her skin had not changed color in months. Among her people, skin color reflected emotional state, but here at the academy, students learned to suppress such displays. Emotional control was considered a mark of academic maturity. She sometimes wondered what her scales would look like if she let herself truly feel something, but the thought was fleeting. Such questions had no place in serious scholarship. Near the back of the room, Loomis stood at their designated position. The Zephyr's crystalline form caught the classroom lights and refracted them in geometric patterns, but Loomis kept their internal glow dimmed to regulation levels. In their youth, they had pulsed with colors that expressed joy, curiosity, and wonder. Their parents had sent them to the academy to learn discipline and focus. They had certainly achieved that. Now Loomis felt like a perfectly cut diamond, flawless, valuable, and completely cold. The clock on the wall display indicated exactly 37 minutes remained in the session. Hylara moved to her next slide. We will now examine the physiological basis for emotional responses in carbon-based life forms. Note that these reactions evolved in primitive environments and serve no function in modern civilized society. The students dutifully opened the reference materials on their screens. Charts appeared showing brain chemistry, neural pathways, and hormone cascades, everything reduced to simple cause and effect, action and reaction, stimulus and response. No student questioned whether something might be missing from this analysis. They had long ago learned not to ask such questions. One seat in the back row remained empty. It had been empty for 3 weeks, ever since the academy had announced they were accepting their first human exchange student. The news had caused barely a ripple among the student body. Humans were a newly contacted species, barely 2 centuries into space travel. What could they possibly contribute to an institution that had refined education across 3,000 years? Hylara had reviewed the humans' file with clinical interest. The species appeared highly emotional, prone to irrational attachments, and frequently made decisions based on abstract concepts like loyalty and love. From an academic perspective, they represented an excellent case study in evolutionary inefficiency. She had prepared several lectures using human behavior as an example of poor adaptation. The classroom door hissed open. Every head turned in perfect unison, a synchronized movement that would have looked choreographed. Into the ordered silence stumbled a figure unlike any the students had seen in person before. He was tall by most standards, with tan skin and dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that suggested he had never consulted regulations about proper grooming. He wore the standard academy uniform, but somehow on him it looked rumpled, lived in, and distinctly unofficial. The human stopped just inside the doorway, slightly out of breath, and looked around the room with bright brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Then he smiled. It was not a polite acknowledgement or a formal greeting gesture. It was a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. Several students felt something strange flutter in their chests, a sensation they could not immediately identify or classify. "Sorry I'm late," the human said, his voice carrying a casual warmth that felt shockingly out of place in the sterile classroom. I got completely turned around in the eastern corridors. Your station layout is way more complex than the maps suggest. But I met this maintenance worker, Gary, I think his name was, and he was trying to fix this door mechanism that kept jamming. I stopped to help because he was using the wrong size coupling wrench, and then we got talking about pressure seal maintenance, and before I knew it, 20 minutes had passed. The students stared. Instructor Hilara's mandibles hung slightly open. The human had just delivered more conversational information in 30 seconds than most students shared in an entire semester. "You must be Jake Morrison," Hilara said, recovering her composure. "Your file indicated a tendency toward tardiness." "Yeah, that's me," Jake said, apparently unbothered by the implicit criticism. "Jake is fine, by the way, and you're right, I do have a bad habit of losing track of time when I'm helping someone or having a good conversation. I'll work on that. Though in my defense, that door is working perfectly now." He walked down the aisle toward the empty seat in the back, and as he passed, students caught a scent they had never encountered before. Something earthy and organic, mixed with what might have been soap and the faint smell of the cookies he had eaten for breakfast. It was shockingly different from the carefully filtered air they were accustomed to. Jake reached his seat and swung an old backpack off his shoulder. The bag itself was a curiosity, covered in colorful patches, showing places from Earth, Yellowstone, the Grand Canyon, New York City. One patch simply said, "Don't panic," in cheerful letters. He pulled out a worn notebook and an actual pen, objects that seemed almost primitive compared to the holographic technology everyone else used. "Now then," Hilara said, attempting to regain control of her classroom. "As I was explaining before the interruption, emotional responses represent cognitive inefficiency. Humans, as it happens, demonstrate particularly strong emotional tendencies, which we will examine as a case study in maladaptive evolution." She pulled up a new slide showing human brain scans during various emotional states. "Notice the excessive activity in the limbic system. This creates what humans call feelings, which frequently override logical analysis." Jake raised his hand. The gesture was so unexpected that Hilar simply stared at it for a moment. Students did not interrupt lectures with questions. They absorbed information and sought clarification during designated review periods. "Yes, Morrison," she said finally. "I was just thinking," Jake said, his tone friendly and curious rather than challenging, "that maybe calling it inefficiency misses something important. Like, sure, emotions can mess things up sometimes, but they're also information, right? Fear tells us when something might be dangerous. Sadness tells us when we've lost something valuable. Joy tells us when we're on the right path." The classroom had gone even quieter than before, if such a thing were possible. This was not how students spoke to instructors. This was not how anyone discussed academic material. But Jake was not finished. He leaned forward slightly, animated by his own thoughts. "My grandmother survived an earthquake once because she felt something was wrong and left the building before it collapsed. She couldn't explain it logically, but her instincts, her emotions saved her life. Seems pretty efficient to me." For the first time in 3 years of teaching at the academy, Instructor Hilara found herself without an immediate response. Around the room, students shifted in their seats, a tiny movement that represented an earthquake of reaction in this controlled environment. Prill felt her skin pulse with the faintest hint of yellow, the color of interest. Limus's internal light brightened by exactly 3%. Korax found himself leaning forward, wanting to hear more. The atmosphere had changed. Something had entered the room, along with the human. Something that had been missing so long that most students had forgotten it existed. In the rows of perfect students, in the sterile academic environment, in the lifeless classroom, something had sparked to life, and Jake Morrison, completely unaware of the small revolution he had just started, simply waited for the instructor's response with an open, curious expression that suggested he genuinely wanted to learn what she thought. The class would never be the same again. The silence stretched for 5 full seconds before Instructor Hilara recovered her composure. Her mandibles clicked twice. a sign of agitation that her students had rarely witnessed. She adjusted her posture and returned her attention to the holographic display. "Your anecdotal evidence, while emotionally compelling, does not constitute scientific data," she said, her tone carefully controlled. "Individual survival instances do not negate the statistical reality that emotional decision-making leads to suboptimal outcomes in controlled studies." Jake nodded slowly, as if genuinely considering her point. "That's fair," he said. "But aren't we studying real life, not just controlled studies? I mean, the galaxy is pretty messy and unpredictable. Maybe emotions evolved because they help us handle that messiness." Several students turned their heads slightly to look at Jake, then quickly faced forward again. Such open dialogue with an instructor simply did not happen. Yet nobody could deny a strange flutter of something in their chests, as if Jake's words had touched a part of them that had been sleeping. Hylara decided the most efficient course of action was to continue with her prepared material. "We will move on to the next section," she announced, pulling up a new slide. "The dangers of attachment-based bonding in social species." The lecture proceeded, but something fundamental had shifted. Students who normally absorbed information with perfect passivity found their minds wandering. Korax caught himself thinking about his clutchmates back on his homeworld, wondering what they were doing. He had not allowed himself such thoughts in months. They served no academic purpose, yet the memory brought a warmth he had almost forgotten existed. Prill's skin flickered with the faintest trace of blue, the color of nostalgia. She remembered swimming in the great pools of her home city, the way the water felt against her scales, the songs her podmates would sing at sunset. When had she last thought of those songs? When had she last felt anything about them? Near the crystalline learning station, Loomis experienced something even stranger. The humans' words had created a resonance inside their structure, a vibration at a frequency they had not felt since childhood. It was uncomfortable and fascinating at the same time. When the class finally ended, students gathered their materials with their usual efficiency, but the atmosphere had changed in subtle ways. Conversations that would normally be purely functional now carried extra weight. "The human speaks strangely," one Vrexian said to another. "Inefficient use of language," the second agreed. But then, after a pause, though perhaps interesting, Jake packed his notebook and pen into his worn backpack, taking his time. As other students filed out in orderly lines, he noticed Prill lingering near her seat, her large eyes watching him with unconcealed curiosity. "Hey," Jake said with an easy smile. "Prill, right? I saw your name on the seating chart." Prill's skin flushed a light purple, surprise and uncertainty. "Yes, I am Prill. You are the human." "Jake," he corrected gently. "I mean, yeah, I'm human, but my name is Jake." This simple distinction seemed to startle her. On the station, students were often identified by their species first, their individual names secondary. "Jake?" she repeated, testing the word. "Your statement during lecture was highly irregular." "Was it?" Jake slung his backpack over one shoulder. "I guess I'm still getting used to how things work here." "Back home, students ask questions and share ideas all the time. It's how we learn best." "Questions are permitted during designated review periods," Prill explained, though her tone suggested she was reciting a rule rather than defending it. "Right, but sometimes the best questions come up right in the moment, you know? Like, you hear something and it makes you think of something else, and if you wait too long, you forget the connection." Jake paused, studying her face. "Can I ask you something? Does your skin color mean different things?" The question was so direct, so personal, that Prill took a step backward. "It is a physiological response, not relevant to academic discussion." "But it's part of who you are," Jake said. "That seems pretty relevant to me. I mean, we're all here to learn about different species, right? How can we do that if we ignore the things that make each species unique?" Before Prill could formulate a response, Loomis drifted closer, their crystalline form chiming softly with each movement. "Your species uses verbal communication exclusively?" the Zephyr asked, their voice emanating from within their structure. "Mostly, yeah," Jake said, turning to include Loomis in the conversation, "though we use body language too. Facial expressions, gestures, that kind of thing." "How do your people communicate?" "Light pulses," Loomis explained. "Color, intensity, pattern. It is more efficient than sound-based language." "That sounds beautiful," Jake said, and the genuine appreciation in his voice made Loomis's internal glow brighten noticeably. "Could you show me something? Maybe what your name looks like in light?" No one had ever asked Loomis such a question. Communication was for conveying information, not for display or aesthetic appreciation. Yet the human's interest seemed sincere. Slowly, Loomis allowed their light to pulse in a gentle pattern, soft blue flowing to white, then back again, with small sparks of yellow. "Wow," Jake breathed. "That's amazing. It's like music you can see." Korax had been observing from near the doorway, preparing to leave, but finding himself drawn to this strange interaction. "You compare many things to other things," the Vexian observed, "like to music." Emotions to information. This is imprecise language. "Maybe," Jake admitted, "but it helps me understand stuff. Metaphors, you know. They build bridges between ideas." He grinned. "See? I just did it again. Ideas don't have actual bridges, but thinking about it that way helps." "Inefficient?" Korax said, but there was less certainty in his voice than usual. "Is it, though?" Jake asked. "I mean, we're all standing here talking instead of just going our separate ways." "That doesn't seem inefficient to me. Seems like we're actually learning about each other." The statement hung in the air. The three students from three different worlds realized that Jake was right. They were engaged in something that had not happened naturally in their entire time at the academy. Genuine, unstructured conversation. "I have a crazy idea," Jake said suddenly. "What if we formed a study group? Not for exams or anything official. Just to talk about what we're learning, share perspectives from our different backgrounds. We could meet somewhere more comfortable than a classroom." "Study groups are permitted only with faculty supervision," Prill said automatically. "Then let's call it a cultural exchange club," Jake suggested. "Or just friends hanging out. Does that need permission?" The word friends landed like a foreign object. These students had classmates, colleagues, and podmates assigned by the housing system. But friends? The concept implied choice, personal connection, emotional attachment, all things the academy discouraged. "Where would we meet?" Loomis asked, their voice carrying a note of something that might have been excitement. "How about the observation deck on level 12? I passed it earlier. It has these huge windows looking out at space, and hardly anyone was there. Seems like a nice place to talk." Jake pulled out his worn notebook and scribbled something. "Tomorrow evening, after the last lecture period, bring anyone else who might be interested." He tore out the page and handed it to Prill, who took it as if it were a precious artifact. Handwritten notes were almost unheard of in an age of digital communication. The paper felt rough and organic in her webbed fingers. "I must return to my quarters," Korax said, but he made no move to leave. "Me too," Prill added. "Same," said Loomis. Yet all three remained as if waiting for something more, though none could have said what. Jake seemed to understand. "Hey, I know this is all probably weird. I'm the weird new alien disrupting your routine. But I think maybe weird isn't always bad. Sometimes it's just different, and different can be good." He smiled again, that open, warm expression that seemed to reach past all their careful defenses. "Anyway, no pressure. If you want to come tomorrow, great. If not, that's okay too." He headed toward the door, then paused and looked back. "Thanks for talking with me. This was nice." After he left, the three students stood in the empty classroom for a long moment. "He thanks us for conversation," Korax said slowly. "As if it were a gift. Perhaps to his species it is," Prill suggested. Her skin had settled into a soft green color that she did not immediately suppress. "Will you attend tomorrow?" Loomis asked. Neither Prill nor Korax answered immediately. The question seemed to require more consideration than it should. Finally, Prill said, "I am curious about this cultural exchange concept." "As am I," Korax admitted. "Purely from an academic perspective." "Of course," Loomis agreed. "Academic purposes only." They left the classroom separately, maintaining proper distance, but each carried with them something new and unsettling. For the first time in years, they felt curious about something that was not on a syllabus. They felt interested in individuals rather than just species classifications. They felt, however faintly, alive. In her office, Instructor Hilara reviewed the day's classroom recordings. She watched the human's interruption multiple times, analyzing his words, his tone, his body language. By all established metrics, his behavior was disruptive and inappropriate. She should file a report, recommend remedial instruction and proper academic conduct. Yet she found herself hesitating.
The other students' responses troubled her.
She had seen engagement in their faces, curiosity in their postures. These were things she had not witnessed in her classes for cycles. Her mandibles clicked thoughtfully as she composed a message to Dean Zarthos, then deleted it, then began again. Outside the station's massive windows, stars wheeled through the endless black. Inside, in quarters scattered across multiple decks, students lay in their sleeping pods thinking about tomorrow, about an observation deck, about a strange human who smiled too much and asked questions at the wrong times, about what it might feel like to have friends. The atmosphere had changed, and there was no going back. The observation deck on level 12 was exactly as Jake had described it. Massive transparent panels stretched from floor to ceiling, offering an unobstructed view of the stars and the distant nebula that painted space in shades of purple and blue. The room itself was mostly empty, designed as a quiet space for contemplation rather than social gathering. A few benches lined the walls, and soft lighting kept the interior dim enough to appreciate the view outside. Jake arrived early, carrying his backpack and a small container. He had chosen a spot near the largest window and was sitting cross-legged on the floor when Prill entered. She hesitated in the doorway, her skin flickering between gray and pale yellow, uncertainty and interest battling within her. "Hey, you came," Jake said, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "I wasn't sure anyone would actually show up." "I told no one I was coming," Prill admitted, moving closer. This felt like something that should remain private. "Fair enough," Jake said. He gestured to the space beside him. "Sit wherever you're comfortable. This isn't formal or anything." Prill lowered herself to the floor, though sitting this way felt strange. At the academy, students sat in designated chairs at appropriate distances. The floor seemed too casual, too intimate. Yet Jake's relaxed posture made it seem natural. Loomis arrived next, their crystalline form chiming softly as they entered. Their internal light was brighter than regulation allowed, pulsing with what might have been nervousness or excitement. "I have never attended an unsanctioned gathering before," they admitted. "Is that what this is?" Jake laughed. "I just thought of it as friends hanging out. But unsanctioned gathering sounds way more exciting." Korax entered last, his forearms held stiffly at his sides. "I am here for academic purposes only," he announced, "to observe human social customs for my comparative behavior studies." "Sure," Jake said with a knowing grin. "Totally academic. Well, come on in, Professor. The study session is about to begin." When all four were settled in a loose circle, an awkward silence fell. None of the alien students knew how to proceed. Unstructured social time was not part of their training. They waited for Jake to provide instructions, an agenda, some kind of framework. Instead, Jake opened his container. "I brought snacks," he said. "My mom sent a care package last week, and I've been saving these for a special occasion." He pulled out small brown discs that smelled sweet and rich. "Chocolate chip cookies. They're kind of a classic Earth comfort food." "We have consumed adequate nutrition today," Korak said. "Additional caloric intake is unnecessary." "It's not about nutrition," Jake explained. "It's about taste, about the experience, about sharing something from my home with you guys. Here, just try one. If you don't like it, no big deal." He passed the container around. Prill took one of the small cookies, examining it closely. The texture was unusual, rough in some places and smooth in others. She brought it to her mouth and took a cautious bite. The sensation that flooded her senses was unlike anything she had experienced. Sweet, yes, but also rich and complex. The texture melted against her tongue, and there were little pieces that tasted different from the rest, more intense and slightly bitter. But more than the physical taste, there was something else. A feeling of warmth, of comfort, of something she could not quite name. "This is," she paused, searching for words, "unexpected. The flavor creates a response that is not merely sensory, right?" Jake said excitedly. "That's the thing about food like this. My mom made these cookies for me when I was a kid, whenever I was sad or scared or just needed comfort. So now when I taste them, I don't just taste chocolate and sugar. I taste home. I taste being cared for." Loomis had been observing the cookie in their own way, analyzing its molecular structure through light refraction. But Jake's words made them reconsider. They absorbed a tiny portion of the cookie into their crystalline matrix, and the simple carbohydrates created a gentle energy pulse through their form. It was inefficient as nutrition, but the experience itself was pleasing. Even Karax, after initial resistance, took a cookie and consumed it methodically. His mandibles worked slowly, and though he said nothing, he took a second cookie when the container came around again. "So," Jake said, leaning back on his hands, "tell me about your homes. Not the stuff from textbooks. I mean, what was it actually like growing up on your worlds?" The question hung in the air. Students at the academy discussed their home planets in terms of atmospheric composition, gravity levels, and technological development. They did not discuss experiences or feelings. My homeworld has standard Vrexian characteristics, Korax began automatically. Oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, 1.1 standard gravity, temperate climate zones. Okay, but what did you like about it? Jake pressed gently. What do you miss? Korax's antennae twitched, a sign of discomfort, but something about the human's open, curious expression made him want to try. There is a sound, he said slowly. In the evening, when the sun sets, the crystal forests on my world create harmonics as they cool. The larger crystals resonate at lower frequencies, the smaller at higher. Together they create music that can be heard across the entire valley where my hive was located. As he spoke, his voice changed. The usual flat precision gave way to something softer, almost reverent. I would climb to the highest platform of our hive structure and listen for hours. The music was never the same twice. It was chaos, but beautiful chaos. That sounds incredible, Jake said quietly. I'd love to hear that someday. I have not thought of it in 3 cycles, Korax admitted. Such thoughts seemed unproductive. Prill's skin had shifted to a deep blue, the color of memory and longing. On my world, we have memory pools, she said. Sacred places where the water holds the experiences of all who have swum there before. When you enter, you can feel the joy and sorrow of your ancestors, your podmates, everyone who shared the water. It is like being alone and being together at the same time. I have never shared this with anyone here, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. It is too personal, too emotional. But when I am homesick, I dream of those pools. I dream of belonging to something larger than myself. Jake nodded, understanding in his eyes. That's beautiful, Prill. Really beautiful. Loomis began to pulse with light, their glow creating patterns on the observation deck walls. My people do not speak of beauty often, the Zephyr said. We value precision, clarity, logic. But there is a place on my world, a canyon of pure crystal, where the twin suns create light shows at dawn and dusk. The refraction patterns are mathematically perfect, but they are also, Loomis paused as if the next word were difficult, they are also breathtaking. The Zephyr's light show intensified, creating a miniature version of what they described. Colors danced across the observation deck, reds flowing into golds, purples bleeding into blues, all in perfect geometric patterns that somehow felt organic and alive. I used to create light displays for my family, Loomis continued. Stories told in color and pattern. But here, such displays seemed frivolous. I dimmed myself to fit Academy standards. That's kind of sad, Jake said gently. I mean, you have this amazing ability to create beauty, and you're hiding it. That's like asking a bird not to sing. Birds sing to communicate and attract mates, Korax pointed out. It serves biological function. Sure, but they also sing because they can. Because it's part of who they are. Jake gestured to the stars outside. Look at all that out there. The universe is huge and complicated and kind of scary sometimes. But it's also full of incredible things. Crystal forests that make music, pools that hold memories, suns that paint canyons with light. Maybe the point isn't just to survive efficiently. Maybe it's also to appreciate the beautiful stuff. A comfortable silence fell over the group. Outside the windows, the nebula swirled in eternal slow motion. Inside, 4 beings from 4 different worlds sat together, not as specimens to be studied or data to be categorized, but as individuals sharing something real.
I want to show you something, Prill said suddenly.
She stood and moved to an empty section of the observation deck. This is a Quellan gratitude gesture. We perform it after sharing food or important experiences with others. She began to move, her body flowing in ways that seemed impossible for her skeletal structure. Her arms traced patterns in the air while her legs created a rhythmic stepping pattern. Most striking of all, her skin cycled through a rainbow of colors, gold for joy, blue for connection, green for peace, purple for gratitude. When she finished, she looked almost embarrassed. I have not done that since leaving home. That was amazing, Jake said. Thank you for sharing it with us. I wish I had something to share, Jake added, but humans are pretty basic. We don't glow or change colors or make music without instruments.
You have words, Loomis observed. You use them to create connections.
To make others feel understood. That is a gift. You also brought cookies, Korax added, reaching for another one. This is an acceptable gift. They all laughed, and the sound was strange and wonderful. Laughter was rare at the Academy. considered an unnecessary emotional expression. But in this moment, it felt like the most natural thing in the universe. As the evening continued, they talked about everything and nothing. Favorite foods from home, embarrassing childhood moments, dreams they had given up on and dreams they still secretly held. The conversation flowed without structure or purpose beyond the simple pleasure of connection. When the station's lights dimmed to indicate late evening hours, they realized they had been talking for 3 hours. It felt like minutes. Same time next week? Jake asked as they prepared to leave. Yes, Prill said immediately. Agreed, Loomis added. For academic purposes, Karak said, but his antennae were tilted in what his species considered a smile. As they left the observation deck separately, maintaining the pretense that this had been a coincidence rather than a planned gathering, each carried something precious. They had shared pieces of themselves they had thought they needed to hide, and in doing so, they had discovered that being truly seen was not weakness. It was connection. It was belonging. It was, perhaps, the beginning of friendship. 3 weeks passed, and the observation deck gatherings grew. What had started as 4 students became 7, then 12, then nearly 20. Word spread through quiet conversations in hallways and brief exchanges between lectures. Students who had spent years maintaining emotional distance found themselves curious about this strange human tradition of simply talking to one another. Instructor Hilara noticed the change immediately. Her students were different. They asked more questions during lectures, not just about facts, but about meaning and context. Their assignments showed traces of personal perspective rather than pure data regurgitation. Most troubling of all, she sometimes caught them smiling at each other between classes. She was not the only one who noticed. In the faculty commons, instructors gathered to discuss the disruption. My students arrived at class discussing something called a memory pool, complained Professor Vex, a elderly Vrexian. This is not relevant to quantum mechanics. Mine have begun incorporating what they call personal experience into their analysis papers, added another instructor. It is highly irregular. Hilara listened to the complaints with mixed feelings. By every traditional measure, this human student was causing problems. He disregarded protocols, encouraged emotional expression, and undermined the careful structure that had made the Galactic Academy successful for centuries. She should report him. She should recommend disciplinary action. Yet when she reviewed her own classroom recordings, she saw something she could not ignore. Her students were engaged. They debated ideas with passion. They connected concepts across disciplines. They were, for the first time in her teaching career, genuinely excited about learning. The situation came to a head on a Thursday morning. Dean Zarthos summoned Hilara to his office, and she knew what was coming before she arrived. The dean was a traditional Quellan administrator, his skin permanently fixed at regulation gray. His office reflected his personality, perfectly organized, temperature-controlled to exact specifications, with no personal items or decorations of any kind. Instructor Hilara, he began without preamble, I have received multiple complaints regarding the human exchange student in your primary lecture group. Jake Morrison appears to be causing significant disruption to Academy protocols. Hilara kept her mandibles perfectly still, revealing nothing. What specific infractions are documented, Dean? He has organized unauthorized student gatherings. He encourages emotional expression in academic settings. He brings food items to share with other students, creating social bonds based on consumption rather than intellectual merit. Zarthos pulled up a file on his display. Most concerning, his influence is spreading. Students across multiple disciplines are beginning to emulate his behavior patterns. His examination scores are exemplary, Hilara noted. He completes all assignments on time and demonstrates thorough understanding of course material. Academic performance is not the issue, Zarthos said, his skin flickering with the faintest hint of orange frustration. The issue is cultural contamination. We have spent 3,000 years developing an educational system based on pure intellectual merit, free from the messiness of emotional attachment. One human student is unraveling that in a matter of weeks. Hilara considered her next words carefully. With respect, Dean, perhaps we should examine why our students are so receptive to this alternative approach. If our system was truly serving their needs, would they abandon it so quickly? Zarthos' skin flashed brighter orange. You are defending this disruption? I am questioning whether it is actually a disruption or an evolution, Hilara said, surprising herself with her own boldness. I propose an experiment. Allow me to incorporate some of Morrison's methodologies into my teaching. We can measure outcomes against a control group using traditional methods. If the results show no improvement, we proceed with disciplinary action. If they show benefit, we consider adapting our approach. The dean's skin slowly returned to gray as he considered. You wish to legitimize emotional teaching methods? I wish to test whether they have merit, Hylara corrected. Is that not the scientific approach? After a long silence, Zarthos nodded. Very well. 1 semester. But Morrison is on formal notice. Any violations of Academy Conduct Code will result in immediate expulsion. Hylara returned to her office and immediately sent a message requesting Jake visit her during office hours. He arrived that afternoon with his usual casual manner, backpack slung over one shoulder, completely unaware of the administrative storm swirling around him. "Hey, Professor," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "What's up?" "You are in danger of expulsion," Hylara said bluntly. Jake's easy smile faded. "What? Why?" "I've been doing all my work acing the tests. Your academic performance is not in question. Your influence on Academy culture is," Hylara explained the dean's concerns and the compromise she had negotiated. "You have 1 semester to prove that your methods produce measurable improvements. I will be restructuring my advanced seminar to incorporate emotional and experiential learning components. You will assist me." "Wait, you want my help?" Jake said, clearly surprised. "I thought you hated my approach." "You called my grandmother's story anecdotal evidence." "It was anecdotal evidence," Hylara said. "But I have been teaching for 12 cycles, and I have never seen students as engaged as they have been these past weeks. I do not understand why your methods work, but I cannot ignore that they do." Her mandibles clicked softly. "I am a scientist first. Science requires following evidence, even when it leads to uncomfortable conclusions." Jake leaned back in his chair, processing this information. "Okay, I'll help, but I need you to understand something. It's not really about methods or techniques. It's about seeing students as people, not just data storage units. It's about making space for them to be whole beings, not just brains on legs." "Explain," Hylara said, pulling up a blank document to take notes. Over the next hour, Jake described his philosophy of education. He talked about creating psychologically safe environments where students felt comfortable taking risks. He explained the importance of connecting abstract concepts to lived experiences. He demonstrated how collaborative learning built both understanding and community. Hylara listened, occasionally interjecting questions. Some of what Jake described aligned with pedagogical theories she had encountered in her training but never implemented. Other concepts were entirely foreign, drawn from human educational traditions that emphasize the whole student rather than pure intellectual development. "I want to try something," Hylara said finally. "In tomorrow's lecture on cross-species communication, I will present a scenario and ask students to respond not just with analysis, but with how they would feel in that situation. You will co-facilitate the discussion." The next day, students filed into classroom 47B with their usual quiet efficiency. But when they saw Jake standing at the front beside instructor Hylara, a ripple of surprise moved through the room. This was unprecedented. Students did not assist with teaching. Hylara began the lecture as normal, but 15 minutes in she paused and pulled up a scenario on the holographic display. "A diplomatic mission has encountered an unknown species. Initial contact was positive, but a misunderstanding has created tension. The alien species has withdrawn and will not respond to further communication attempts. Your mission is at risk of failure." She paused and looked at her students. "Rather than simply analyzing the situation, I want you to imagine you are the diplomat. How would you feel? What emotions would you be experiencing? And how might those emotions inform your next actions?" The classroom fell silent. This was not how questions were asked at the academy. Students glanced at each other, uncertain how to proceed. Jake stepped forward. "Let me start. If I were that diplomat, I'd feel frustrated first. Like I tried to make a good connection and something went wrong and I don't even know what. Then I'd probably feel worried, because this mission matters and I might have messed it up. And underneath all that, I'd feel curious. What did I miss? What does this alien species value that I didn't understand?" He paused, looking around the room. "Those feelings aren't obstacles to solving the problem. They're information. Frustration tells me I need to slow down. Worry tells me the stakes are high. Curiosity tells me I need to learn more. So my next action would be to find someone who can help me understand what I'm missing." Slowly, hesitantly, a hand rose. It was Prill, her skin cycling through uncertain colors. "I would feel shame," she said quietly. "My people value harmony and connection. To fail at creating understanding would feel like a personal failure." "That's honest," Jake said encouragingly. "And that feeling of shame What would it tell you to do? It would drive me to try harder, Prill said, her voice growing stronger. To study their culture more deeply. To find a way to repair the damage. Another hand rose. Then another. Students who had never voluntarily spoken in class began sharing their perspectives. They talked about fear and hope, about pride and humility, about the complex emotional landscape of cross-cultural communication. Korax, who had remained silent, finally spoke. For 3 cycles, I have studied communication theory as abstract principle, but this discussion has revealed something I missed. Communication is not just about transmitting information. It is about creating understanding between beings who experience the universe differently. Emotion is not static in that process. It is central. Hilara watched in silence as her classroom transformed. Students were leaning forward, responding to each other, building on ideas collaboratively. They were thinking critically, but they were also thinking creatively. They were using both logic and empathy. The class ran 20 minutes over its scheduled time. No one seemed to notice or care. As students filed out, their conversations continued into the hallway. Hilara heard them making plans to meet, to discuss ideas further, to work on projects together. This was not the silent, isolated student body she had taught for years. This was a community. Jake lingered as the room emptied. So, what did you think? Hilara's mandibles moved in what might have been the Vrexian equivalent of a thoughtful smile. I think, Morrison, that you may have just saved your own academic career, and possibly revolutionized mine. She pulled up her notes from the session, already planning how to incorporate these methods into future lectures. We will continue this experiment. But understand the Dean will be watching closely. We must demonstrate measurable outcomes. We will, Jake said confidently. Because when students care about what they're learning, when they feel connected to the material and to each other, they don't just memorize information, they actually understand it. And that's what education should be about. As Jake left the classroom, Hilara sat alone with her thoughts. For the first time in her long career, she felt something she had not experienced since her own student days, excitement about teaching. The human had not just disrupted her classroom. He had reminded her why she had become an educator in the first place. The experiment had begun, and there was no turning back. The semester progressed with remarkable speed. Hilara's experimental class became the talk of the academy, drawing attention from faculty and students alike. Those enrolled in the course showed unprecedented improvement not just in test scores, but in practical application of knowledge. When faced with complex scenarios requiring cross-cultural understanding, these students demonstrated abilities that far exceeded their traditionally taught peers. The observation deck gatherings continued to grow. What had started as 4 students meeting casually had evolved into a thriving community of nearly 50 individuals from across the station. They called themselves simply the Circle, and they met 3 times a week to share stories, discuss ideas, and practice what Jake called authentic connection. During one gathering, Loomis presented something they had been working on for weeks. The Zephyr moved to the center of the observation deck and began to glow with increasing intensity. Then, synchronized with the station's external lights dimming for night cycle, Loomis created a light show unlike anything the students had witnessed. Colors exploded through their crystalline form, creating patterns that told a story. Blues and greens depicted their homeworld's crystal canyons. Golds and reds showed the twin suns rising. Then, in a transition that made several students gasp, the colors shifted to represent Loomis's journey to the academy. Dark purples of loneliness, grays of conformity, and finally warm oranges and yellows of newfound friendship. When the display ended, the observation deck erupted in applause. Loomis pulsed with embarrassed pink light, but their inner glow showed pure joy. I had forgotten what it felt like to create freely, Loomis said. Thank you for reminding me who I am. Prill stood next, her skin shimmering with determination. I have been thinking about my people's memory pools. We share experiences through water, but I realize we can share experiences through story as well. I want to tell you about the day I decided to leave my homeworld. She spoke for 20 minutes, describing her family's concern, her own fear and excitement, the feeling of the ship lifting away from the only home she had ever known. As she talked, her skin cycled through every emotion, the blue of sadness at leaving, the gold of hope for the future, the purple of love for those she left behind, the green of determination to succeed. When she finished, many in the circle had tears in their eyes, another human expression that had become accepted within the group. Jake had explained that tears were not weakness, but a physical manifestation of deep feeling, and somehow that permission had freed them to express emotions they had suppressed for years. The changes extended beyond the circle. Students in Hilara's experimental class began applying their new skills in other courses, In engineering seminars, they considered not just technical specifications, but how different species might interact with technology differently. In history classes, they analyzed events through emotional and cultural lenses, not just political and economic ones. In science labs, they collaborated more effectively, understanding that diverse perspectives led to better problem-solving. Dean Zarthos watched these developments with growing unease. He conducted his own assessments, comparing student performance across multiple metrics. The data was undeniable. Students in Hilara's experimental program showed a 23% improvement in practical application tests. Their ability to handle complex, ambiguous situations had increased by 37%. Most remarkably, their collaborative project outcomes exceeded traditional students by nearly 50%. But numbers alone did not tell the full story. What truly disturbed the dean was the cultural shift happening throughout the academy. Students who had maintained proper emotional distance for years were forming genuine friendships. They laughed in hallways. They gathered in common areas to talk rather than simply review materials. They seemed, by all observable measures, happy. For an institution built on the principle that emotional detachment enhanced learning, this transformation represented either a revolution or a catastrophe. Zarthos could not yet determine which. He called a faculty assembly to discuss the situation. Instructors filled the conference hall, their postures reflecting the divide emerging among the teaching staff. Some sat rigid and disapproving. Others leaned forward with interest. A few whispered to colleagues, behavior that would have been unthinkable a semester ago. "We face a critical decision," Zarthos began, his skin carefully maintained at neutral gray. "The experimental program has produced measurable academic improvements. However, it has also fundamentally altered academy culture. We must determine whether to expand these methods, maintain the current limited trial, or return to traditional approaches." Professor Vex stood immediately. "The old methods have served us for 3,000 years. They have produced countless scholars, diplomats, and leaders. To abandon them based on one semester of data is reckless." But Hilara rose as well, her mandibles set with determination. "With respect, colleague, we are not abandoning rigor or academic excellence. We are enhancing it by acknowledging that students are complete beings, not simply processing units for information. The data shows our enhanced approach produces better outcomes in every meaningful metric. Better test scores are not the only measure of success," Vex countered. "What of discipline? What of emotional control? These students form attachments that will cause pain when they inevitably separate after graduation." "Yes," Hilara agreed simply. "They will experience pain. They will also experience joy, connection, and belonging. They will understand on a fundamental level what it means to work with beings different from themselves. Is that not the purpose of this academy? To prepare students for a galaxy filled with diverse species and complex challenges?" The debate continued for 2 hours. Faculty members shared observations, concerns, and data. Slowly, a consensus began to emerge. The academy could not ignore results this significant, but neither could they abandon all structure and tradition. Finally, Dean Zarthos called for a vote. The measure passed by a narrow margin. The academy would integrate emotional and experiential learning methods into all programs while maintaining rigorous academic standards. It was a compromise, but it was also a revolution. As news spread through the station, students in the circle celebrated. They had not set out to change the academy, only to find space to be themselves. Yet in doing so, they had transformed an institution that had remained unchanged for millennia. Jake found himself surrounded by grateful students after the announcement. Prill's skin glowed with every color of joy. Loomis created a celebratory light display. Even Korax allowed his antennae to tilt in a genuine smile. "You did this," Prill said to Jake. "You changed everything." "No," Jake said, shaking his head. "You all changed everything. I just asked you to be yourselves. You're the ones who had the courage to actually do it." The semester ended with a final gathering in the observation deck. Over 70 students attended, representing every species and discipline on the station. They sat together in loose circles, sharing food from their various homeworlds, telling stories, and simply enjoying each other's company. Instructor Hilara attended as well, at Jake's invitation. She sat slightly apart at first, uncertain of her role in this informal setting, but Korax approached and gestured to a space beside him. "You took a risk for us, instructor," he said. "That required courage." Hilara settled beside her student, allowing herself to relax in a way she never had before. "I simply followed the data," she said, but her tone was warm. "You followed your students," Korax corrected gently. You saw that we needed something more, and you provided it. That is what great teachers do. As the evening progressed, Hylara found herself sharing stories of her own student days, of dreams she had set aside, of the slow calcification of wonder into routine. The students listened with the same attention and empathy they showed each other, and something inside her that had been locked away for cycles began to open. Near the end of the gathering, Jake stood to address the group. "I want to thank all of you," he said. "When I came to this academy, I was terrified. I was the only human, the weird alien who didn't understand your customs or your ways of learning. I thought I'd have to change myself completely to fit in." He paused, looking around at all the faces, both familiar and new. "But you taught me something important. Real belonging doesn't come from making yourself smaller to fit into existing spaces. It comes from having the courage to be fully yourself and creating space for others to do the same. You all did that. You took a risk on friendship, on vulnerability, on connection, and look what you built." He gestured to the room full of students from different worlds, different backgrounds, different ways of being, all choosing to spend their time together. "This right here is what the galaxy needs. Not just tolerance or cooperation, but genuine understanding and care. You're going to graduate and go out there and carry this with you. You're going to change your worlds the way you changed this academy." The observation deck fell silent as students absorbed his words. Then Loomis began to glow, creating a pattern of light that spread across the ceiling like stars. Other students joined in with their own expressions, Prill's skin cycling through colors of gratitude and hope, Vrexian students creating harmonic clicks, others contributing in ways unique to their species. It was not planned or coordinated, but it was beautiful. A spontaneous celebration of connection, of community, of the truth that they were stronger and more complete together than they had ever been alone. The academic year ended with graduation ceremonies. Students who had entered the academy as isolated individuals preparing for solitary careers left as a connected community ready to transform the galaxy. They exchanged contact information, made promises to stay in touch, and cried openly at the thought of separation. Jake stood among them, his own time at the academy complete. He had accomplished what he came to do, earned his certification in Xeno studies, but more importantly, he had discovered that his own humanity, his tendency toward emotion and connection, was not a weakness to overcome, but a gift to share. As he prepared to board his transport home, his friends from the circle gathered to see him off. Prill embraced him, her skin glowing with every color of affection. Loomis created one final light display in his honor. Corax offered the traditional Vrexian gesture of deep respect, all four arms extended. "You will return to visit?" Prill asked, her voice hopeful. "Definitely," Jake promised. "But you don't need me anymore. You've got each other. You've got this whole new way of learning and being together. Keep it going. Spread it to others." The transport's departure alarm sounded. Jake shouldered his worn backpack, now covered with new patches from the friends he had made. As the doors closed, he looked back one final time at the observation deck windows, where he had first gathered with 3 uncertain students. The academy looked different now. Through those same windows, he could see students sitting in groups, talking and laughing. The sterile, lifeless atmosphere had been replaced with something warm and vital. One human had not changed the academy alone, but he had lit a spark that others had carried forward into flame. As his transport pulled away from Station Nexus 7, Jake smiled. The galaxy was vast and filled with countless species, each unique, each valuable. And somewhere out there, other classrooms waited. Other students sat in silence. Other institutions had forgotten that education was about more than data transfer. The work of connection, of bringing life to lifeless spaces, would continue. And he had helped show that it was possible. The class had felt lifeless, but one human had changed the atmosphere at once, and that change would echo across the stars for generations to come.